All right, if you want to go ahead and turn in your Bibles, we are to the beginning of chapter 11, I believe it is. Let me get my notes out. And as we have been reminded, we've had a few weeks off, so let me kind of give you that same summary again. We do believe that Genesis is an historic book of the Bible. We don't believe it's just a made-up story. We don't believe it's a fairy tale. We believe that Genesis is history. And we believe it's our history. It's the history of how we came into existence. As you saw in the video and as we've talked already, God created everything from nothing. He did it in 6 literal days, morning and night and the next day. He made it all for us, the creation that He breathed the living soul into. The only part of creation He breathed the living soul into was man. Man blew it. Man sinned in the Garden of Eden. We had murder with Cain. And we had a downward spiral that God had to judge. He judged with a worldwide flood, and we do believe that the entire earth was covered with water. Nothing raised above the water except the ark. One big sphere with one boat floating around on it. And we believe that is true. That nothing survived except what was inside the ark as far as animals and men go. And they went out and they multiplied. Now we covered the last time about the 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We talked about the fact we're from Japheth. Japheth went to the north, which the Europeans would have come from. Ham mostly went to the south, which would have been the African continent, and many of them. And then, Ham, most of the descendants were the descendants there in Canaan and some of the other nations as well. So we got that discussion, but now we've kind of got to go back. How did they get there? Right? We talked about, we know where they went. Japheth went north, Ham went south. Shem kind of went along the Middle East, but they didn't start there. They all started together in a place called Babylon. So won't you turn there with me now, Genesis chapter 11, and it's not ironic that they're in Babylon. Genesis 11, just the first 9 verses to get through this familiar story. All right. Here we go. At one time, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words. As the people migrated to the east, they found a plain in the land of Babylonia and settled there. They began saying to each other, "Let's make bricks and harden them with fire." In this region, bricks were used instead of stone, and tar used for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build a great city for ourselves with a tower that reaches into the sky. This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world." But God told us to do that. But the Lord came down to look at the city and the tower the people were building. "Look," He said, "the people are united and they all speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages. Then they won't be able to understand each other." In that way, the Lord scattered them all over the world, and they stopped building the city. That is why the city was called Babel, because that is where the Lord confused the people with different languages. In this way, He scattered them all over the world. Father, thank You for Your word. It's truth. Guide us in Your truth. May we see practical application from the story tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, you all remember this is another one of those coloring sheets from Sunday school or children's church. We all colored the Tower of Babel. We remember that story, but often, unfortunately, we don't get the full story that goes with it. And that's what we're going to do tonight. Basically, this is preserved because we still bear the same heart that the men and women did back then, and we still have the same tendencies that they did, as you're going to see, and I will attempt to draw out. So let's begin with human arrogance, okay? We have human arrogance. Back in chapter 9, verse 1, God gives Noah the command to fill the entire earth. A few verses later, in verse 7 of chapter 9, God says, repopulate the earth. Remember, everybody on the planet died. This was like a reset, a hard reset. We talked about that. And they were the only people alive. And so they were given a job. You are now to go and spread out all over the surface of the earth and be our people. Now, when you stop and think about it, I thought about the pioneers that came to the United States and then the pioneers that went out west. You stop and think, this is not an easy task. And again, I tried to reason why they would do what they did. I tried to look at the other side. On the surface, it seems like a simple thing to do, but stop and think about it. They were supposed to leave their parents and their siblings and their friends and move. And every time they had more parents and siblings and friends, they were supposed to move. They were supposed to be nomads, basically, until they spread out and covered the entire earth. That would have taken generation after generation after generation. That would have been a hard cycle to live with when you stop and think about it. When our children grow up today, many of them stay close to home if they know what's good for them. But it seems to be good for them. It seems to be good for us, right? We get to see them on a regular basis. When they need help, they can still reach out. They're still close enough that they can do that. But a few of them will branch out and do like I did and take their daughter and their grandchildren to the other side of the planet. And take them to Hawaii. Some people will do that. There are some pioneers out there. But even in that, today, the technology lets us stay in contact. I mean, you look at it today, you can pretty much FaceTime or Skype people from anywhere all over the planet, live. You can talk and see them. And if you want to see them in person, you can be pretty much anywhere on the planet in 24 hours. So we live in a time in a day that even if they scatter, we can still have good contact, healthy contact, and maintain our relationships. They didn't have that. They walked everywhere they went. They walked across those lands. They went across on boats. They couldn't go back. And so when you stop and think about it, I understand why they would want to settle, and that was their response. Man's response is, we will settle. God says, go and distribute and cover the earth. Man says, well, I've got a better idea. We will settle. And I understand their temptations, but nothing justifies disobedience against God. It's standard temptation. Nothing justifies disobedience against God. They had gotten comfortable, just like we have, in their lifestyles, but they maybe got too comfortable in their relationship with God.
They were committing adultery and sorcery and
they didn't do much better than those previous generations, but this time God doesn't destroy them. Okay?
He decided to separate them.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about tonight. Now, something came along that didn't come out immediately. They used cheap building materials. All right, this is something that is on purpose. Now, if we could read this section of the Bible in Hebrew, it would be poetic. It would rhyme. It would have rhythm. It's neat the way it's laid out in Hebrew, but it's lost in English. But the irony is not lost in English. What we see is God tells them to do something. They decide not to do it. They get comfortable, and they settle with cheaper materials, or they settle with the cheaper things. They use brick instead of stone. It even said that. They use tar instead of mortars. You don't have to be a mason to know the difference between these materials. Stone is much more sturdy and rugged than man-made bricks. Mortar is much more solid than tar. And so when you stop and see it, Moses is actually, many believe, he's mocking their efforts when he writes this. They were settling not just to be together and be comfortable. They were settling for lesser things than what God had to promise them. This is a clear illustration, and again, many of the scholars pulled it out. When man goes his own way, he often settles for less than God has to offer. All right, that's a good illustration to see this. When man goes his own way, he often settles for less than God has to offer. And I thought about this. There are many examples of it, but the example of relationships came to my mind because it's what I counsel on and do all the time. It's my top thing. Let's say a young person grows up in church. All right, they know how God feels about relationships. They've made a profession of faith, but then they don't want to do the time, and they decide to settle. Instead of waiting and doing the work and doing a marriage properly, they decide to settle and get the initial rewards of going ahead and moving in with their significant other, living together just like the rest of the world does. They settle in their relationship instead of doing the full course. And what do? They get a cheapened relationship. They get a relationship that's not as strong. They get a relationship that's not as satisfying. They get a relationship that's not bound together as well, as if we would go the long haul and do it God's way. So that's just an illustration that came to my mind. You may have others. When we settle, we often settle for less than God's best. And that's the problem with it. That's what they had done here. Again, many believe that's what Moses was bringing out, why he mentioned the bricks versus the stone, the tar versus the mortar. So, back to the Genesis story. Sinful man has decided to displace God. That's basically the problem. He wants to do his own thing, his own way. So he's moving, instead of moving, he settles down, and he settles for less when it comes to building the tower. Now we see the motive, and this is probably the main point. The motive is to make a name for himself. All right? The motive is to make a name for himself. God's plan was to spread them out, to spread His name across the planet and make His name high. But instead they've decided we want to make our own name high. The New Living Translation is very relevant here. Man chooses to make a name for himself instead of making a name for God. In other words, man wants to be famous. Okay? Man wants to be famous. There's a good example of that in the music industry today. Who's heard of Katie Hudson? Okay, I see Teresa. Anybody else? Katie Hudson? Well, you probably didn't hear her because her first album flopped. It was a Christian album. So she changed her name to Katy Perry. She didn't get enough fame out of the first album that was done to bring the Lord fame. And so she changed her name and changed her approach and sold out for something less. All for her own name. There are many examples like that. That's the first one that came to my mind. Right? What's in a name? Well, it depends on how you're looking at it. Is it my name or is it God's name? And why am I doing it? That was the main reason this is a problem. They were trying to build a name for themselves instead of a name for God. We do the same thing. Again, we'd be careful throwing stones. God often tries to move us in His direction. Instead of following Him, we settle. We settle for less. We focus on our own pleasure and our own names instead of His. Okay? As we'll see, settling is not the best name when God says to move. God's awareness. God's awareness. The first 4 verses focus on man's activities in the story. The subject of the verse in 5 shifts to God. And where is God and what is God doing? And this is, again, not a coincidence. God's position, He is higher than the tower. Yeah, if you understood Hebrew, this would make a lot of sense. God is higher than the tower. In Hebrew, again, it's poetic here, lost in English. In verse 4, man says he's going to build a tower that reaches the sky. This tower was so high it makes him famous. And then the next line is, the Lord came down. All right, you got to put that together. Verse 4, we're going to build a tower that's so high that makes us the highest. And then the Lord came down. Because He's always the highest. He's always higher. That's often lost again in the children's version of this story. But you see in this truth that Moses is recording for us that the Lord is always the highest. No matter what we do, He's always above all and over all. We find that in Isaiah 40:22, God sits above the circle of the earth. He sits above the circle of the earth. The people below seem like grasshoppers to Him. Right? God is above the circle of the earth. He's over all, He's above all, and man often forgets this. I think the most vulnerable are those in positions of influence and authority. Someone once said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we got to be careful of that, right? It's real easy to lose sight of God being higher when we're kind of high ourselves. And so He is always above all, and He misses nothing. He is always watching. Always watching. If you have or have had small children, you'll remember the leverage that you have around November. All right, what can you tell your children? You better be good because Santa's watching. All right, anybody ever use that? Oh, we had to use it. Better watch out. You're not crying. You're not crying. I'm telling you, my Santa Claus is coming. We use that, right? And we can get some temporary results with our kids because they do think that there's going to be reward for good behavior because Santa's watching. Well, guess what? God watches all the time, and He doesn't miss anything. And yes, He rewards good behavior, and He doesn't reward bad behavior. So, He's always watching. There's a song by Casting Crowns. They revived it not too long ago on their Christmas album. It's called I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. You know that song, right? Do anybody know the history behind that song? All right, it's a really neat history. It goes all the way back to 1863. And it's a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that it came from. Some of you may remember the verse that's relevant from the psalm. God's not dead, nor does he sleep. God's not dead. And they borrowed that. That's not Casting Crowns. That's hundreds of years old by Longfellow. And it is biblical, obviously. He did not make it up himself. It comes from verses like this one. He, the Lord, who watches over you, will not slumber. He will not sleep. He is not dead. He's always watching. He does not sleep. Longfellow is correct. The next line in his poem is appropriate for the rest of the discussion. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail. I feel like Alex Trebek. Right? That sound like Mr. Trebek. All right. For now, let's end this portion of the narrative just with this reminder. God's above all. He's over all, and he sees all. That's kind of the point of this third section in our study. Finally, God will prevail. God's response. Now, I need to deal with two things here, just a matter of Bible study. The first thing is that things seem to be out of order. When we read verse 10, it already said that the people were distributed according to their languages and their nations. Right? If you go back to that chapter, you'll find that. At the end, it says they're distributed among their languages and among their nations. Well, then, in the next chapter, it seems like they're all together again, and then they're scattered again. No, that's not how it works. The ancient writers did not write chronologically, they wrote story-wise. And so that's how they put it all together in 10. Then now they go and explain how they were scattered and how they got their languages in 11. So they're not as interested in chronology as we are, so don't let that hold you up. This is one event that fits inside of the last event. Now the second thing we have to address is a misconception here according to the wording again. In verse 6 we hear, after this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. That can sound a little bit strange, God saying something like that. Was God afraid that man was going to get too powerful? No. God was not threatened by the situation. Instead, he was troubled by what would happen to humanity if they continued. They continued for generation after generation, and the whole world became wicked, and God's intervention was the flood. If they continued at Babel, they were going to continue along that path again, so everything became wicked, and God says, I'm not going to flood the earth again, so what am I going to do? I'm going to confuse their language. So instead of flooding the earth, again, as he promised not to do, he decided, all right, I'm going to fix this by scattering them according to their language. Okay? So he confused their language. Ever wondered what that first language was? I'm goofy like that. Did they speak Hebrew? All right, is that just the original language? Did they speak English? That's funny because we know better than that. What did they speak? They all spoke the same language. They all agreed with each other. They all knew that it said they used the same words. And so it's not that they just understood each other. They knew the same words. I don't know, but this is kind of neat. I learned this, and I know you can't read it. Anybody ever heard of the language tree? This is really kind of cool. My wife has, because she learned it the same place I did. We learned it from our interpreter in Latvia. All right, because we were trying to learn a little bit of Latvian, and she was trying to explain why we couldn't learn it. If you look, you got the Indo-Europeans, you can see that down the bottom at the root of the tree. And then it branches out. You got English way, way, way over here. It came along a lot later. And each of the branches come off another branch. And we're smart enough to figure this out. Right? We've got the intellect to kind of say, okay, this language came from here, this language came from here, and trace it all the way back. But just like evolution, the language tree does not name the origin. The origin is Babylonian. The Bible does. Just as the Bible gives us the beginning of creation, it tells us in the beginning God, He spoke everything into existence. The language tree starts with Babylonian, because everybody spoke the same language at the bottom. And the scatter, the branches, happened when God confused their languages. We can explain the tree. We've got the answer to why there is a language tree. It started off the same at the bottom, and it split up. Notice Indo-European, Middle Eastern. All right, it would have come from Babylon. So I thought that was kind of neat, that God used that, and we can explain why there is a language tree. So it all comes from that area of the world. Now, so what can we get from our study? What can we gain? All right, we must leave off after chasing a name and find our identity in Christ. Okay? We must leave off chasing after a name and find our identity in Christ. That really is the overarching teaching behind the Tower of Babylon. They wanted to be famous. They wanted a name for themselves. God said, no, you messed this up. My plan is that you go out and make a name for me, not for you. And that plan is still the same today. Another thing you could draw from this, when God says move, move. All right? Some of you have experienced it. We've experienced it several times. I experienced it in the Navy. All right? I loved it until I didn't, and it was time to move. I experienced it at General Motors. I loved it until I didn't, and it was time to move. I experienced it at Toyota. I loved it until I didn't, and it was time to move. I still love it here, so that's okay. But when God says move, don't dig in and settle. He will make you miserable. Trust me, I got stories. Right? I got stories. Okay? So let's go about now and make sure we're making a name of Him and not of ourselves. Beth, should you come? Let's do our last song. It's funny. Dreamer kind of led into this.
I got a good one for you.
Go ahead, Stephen, she's speaking.
18. Okay? It's in this one. It says, for example, never sacrifice your son or your daughter as a burnt offering. And do not let your people practice fortune telling, or sorcery, or interpret omens, or engage in witchcraft, or cast spells, or function as mediums, or visits, or call forth the spirits of the dead. Now, you know, this plays something on me because I never would let my child, you know, like you go to a carnival,
Right.
and they have a fortune teller there. I believe that you should never let your children go into that.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of things out there that we...
Explain to them why.
Right.
The Bible speaks totally against it, and it can get in your life, and it can cause you to... Witchcraft is more obvious this day and time than it's there.
Yeah.
And
Unfortunately.
it's easy to
get caught up
get
in.
into
Yeah.
a child's life.
Yeah.
And it can start from a carnival. It can start from just anything.
Yeah.
Like the Ouija boards and all this stuff like this.
Oh yeah, there are evil spirits today.
So people that aren't Christians, they just let their children go willy-nilly anywhere, and they take this on.
All right, stand up with us, please. He touched me, number 227.